In 1 week, the Biden presidency will come to an end, ironically, the same way that it began, with a handoff involving Donald Trump. In January 2021, Donald Trump left the White House reportedly with no intention of returning. Biden took the oath of office, promising to be a bridge to a better future. Well, 4 years on, that bridge is now Biden's exit ramp. Joe Biden will leave office in the eyes of many, downgraded and diminished. And Donald Trump, he moves back in. His popularity, his power, stronger than ever. I'm Brink in Berlin. This is The Day. We begin the day in the final week of the Biden presidency. Joe Biden is preparing to leave the White House. His exit may also lower the curtain on an American foreign policy no longer fit for purpose, made for a world order increasingly out of order. Even before Joe Biden became U.S. president, he spoke of this time being an inflection point in history, a fork in the road. One direction, democracy; the other direction, autocracy. Biden has repeatedly pointed to China as America's 21st century rival, Beijing offering an alternative to the post-war rules-based international order led by the U.S. Biden may have wanted to walk us into the next great American century, but the problems of the past kept holding him back. Echoes of the Cold War with Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the malaise of the Middle East that broke out anew with the war between Israel and Hamas. Today at the U.S. State Department, Biden thanked America's diplomats, and he offered his take on the world that he is leaving behind.
Right now, in my view, thanks to our administration, the United States is winning the worldwide competition. Compared to 4 years ago, America is stronger. Our alliances are stronger. Our adversaries and competitors are weaker. We have not gone to war to make these things happen. During my presidency, I've increased America's power at every dimension. We've increased our diplomatic power, creating more allies than the United States has ever had in the history of our nation. We've increased our military power, making the most significant investments in the defense industrial base in decades. We've increased the technology power, taking the lead in artificial intelligence and other technologies of the future. And we've increased the economic power, building the most dynamic economy in the world from the bottom up and the middle out, not the top down.
All right, for more, I'm joined now by Christopher Chivvis. He's director of the American Statecraft Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He also recently served as the U.S. National Intelligence Officer for Europe. Mr. Chivvis, it's good to have you with us. Let me just ask you, is the U.S. in a stronger or weaker position in the world after 4 years of the Biden administration?
Well, I think the question is, to what extent is the United States in a stronger or weaker position on account of the policies that the Biden administration has pursued? Now, if I were going to give them grades, let's say, I think I'd give them probably an A, 2 Bs, and a C. I give them an A on the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which definitely put the United States in a stronger position. I give them a B when it comes to Europe and to China. And I'd give them a C on the Middle East, where I think the United States is actually in a much weaker position than it was when the administration came into office 4 years ago.
Biden's foreign policy priorities were seemingly hijacked by Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the conflict breaking out in the Middle East, as you said. I mean, what's going to stop any other American president from becoming enslaved to circumstances like this?
Well, it's a good question, and there's a big debate about whether or not the United States gets dragged into these kind of conflicts. For example, the conflict that we're increasingly involved in the Middle East right now, because the world is forcing itself on the United States, and these conflicts are unavoidable, or whether or not the United States can actually exercise some degree of choice and opt to distance itself from some of these conflicts, take a back seat, and not get involved in all of them. This is obviously a big debate that we're having in America. And President Trump has indicated that he is prepared to take more of a backseat on some of these conflicts, but not on others.
Mm-hmm. You know that Trump is not a big fan of the term Pax Americana, this rules-based international order with American leadership. I'm wondering, After 4 years of the Biden administration, is the Pax Americana, is it an unworthy goal? Is it even anachronistic in the 21st century?
Well, of course, it depends upon what you mean by the Pax Americana. I think President Trump will probably pay a lot of attention to defending what he considers to be American interests. This has been a position that he's taken again and again, both in his first administration and then during the campaign. And it was an effective one during the campaign. For example, when he talked about thinking about America's interests first when it came to the war in Ukraine. The question is whether or not he will continue to support the broad institutional order that has been built up since the end of World War II, and which has been really quite beneficial to the United States in some ways. So I think that's an area where people have got some concern as to whether or not he might pursue his version of American interests at the expense of that order. Certainly, he's not going to pursue it if he thinks that it's a liberal international order. But I can see a scenario in which he'll pursue maintaining or at least not attempting to dismantle multilateral institutions that benefit the United States.
You remember Steve Bannon at the beginning of the first Trump presidency talked about looking at foreign policy and throwing everything against the wall and seeing what sticks. I wonder, this time around, do you see Donald Trump working with a foreign policy strategy, or do you see him more as the man coming in a second time with a wrecking ball?
I think there's going to be a lot of trial and error. I think we know what the focus is going to be. It's going to be Iran, it's going to be China, and it's going to be negotiating an end to the war in Ukraine. So if he's successful on negotiating an end to the war in Ukraine, that will probably be a positive thing for the United States. If he ends up in a war with Iran, however, that could be quite dangerous for America and for the world. With China, it's going to be interesting to see how his administration plays out. He's obviously ready to take it very, very tough to the Chinese when it comes to trade issues, impose very, very large tariffs. The question is whether or not he'll have the same attitude when it comes to defense issues and Taiwan. A lot of the people who are surrounding him are very, very hawkish on defense issues, but it's not at all clear that Trump shares their view. So I think I'll be watching very closely what he says about things like the traditional U.S. one China policy and how he presents his views when it comes to Taiwan.
Do you think that Donald Trump is maybe this necessary catalyst that the United States needs in order to move its foreign policy to the next place?
It's a great question. It's really hard to change American foreign policy. So many of our policies are deeply institutionalized. There are many special interests that are behind them. And so I think we have to credit the first Trump term with really breaking some of the taboos and opening up the space for change in American foreign policy. It's most clear on China. Certainly, Trump's tough approach to China scared a lot of people at the start, but now basically everyone agrees that the United States needs to take a tougher line than it was before with China. The question is whether or not that catalyst that you're referring to catalyzes some kind of a chain reaction that gets out of control and puts us in a world of chaos, which obviously would not be in America's or anyone else's interests.
What do you make of the reaction that we've seen here in Europe to what Trump said last week about, the U.S. possibly, taking over Greenland?
I think Trump says a lot of things in order to stay in the news and keep the attention on him. I doubt whether that is a policy that we're going to see any kind of serious action on over the course of the next 4 years. So I think we got to think about the big challenges that he's come back to recurrently, not the things that he throws out more or less on a whim on any given day of the week.
Let me ask you, before we run out of time, the late U.S. President Jimmy Carter, he was buried last week. He was known for pushing a values-based U.S. foreign policy. Will historians one day mark the end of that approach with the end of the Biden presidency?
I think that U.S. foreign policy in the mid-21st century will have values behind it, but they're not going to be the same. They're not going to receive the same kind of emphasis that they received in the Biden administration or in the George W. Bush or even the Clinton administration. So I wouldn't say the end of America's preference for promoting a values-based foreign policy, but probably some of the kind of distinctions, like the distinction that Biden made between autocracy and democracy will recede as we go forward. It's just the reality of the complex and challenging political environment that the United States has to operate in the mid-21st century.
Christopher Chivvis from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Mr. Chivvis, we appreciate your time and your analysis tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, for more now, I'm joined by Cathryn Clüver Ashbrook. She's a political analyst and a senior advisor at the Bertelsmann Foundation here in Berlin. Cathryn, it's good to have you on the show. Again, when you look at that report, you know a lot has happened in the last 4 years on the world stage: Afghanistan, Ukraine, the Middle East. How would you rate Biden's performance in managing these conflicts?
Look, given the cataclysm of challenges that Joe Biden faced, not only coming into office, think about the tail end of the COVID pandemic and American economic situation that looked like it was all but in ruins. You've seen, at least domestically in those early 2 years, the groundwork laid for, well, really a rejuvenation of American strength. And in fact, everybody, economists and political scientists alike, think the American economy is truly something to boast about. But on the foreign policy side, the record is largely more checkered. You just heard, again, the two big foreign policy blunders of the Biden administration early on when it had vowed to anchor its entire policy making in close relations to allies, and then pulled out of Afghanistan, which indeed was a feat that his two predecessors couldn't do, but did it in a way that it alienated allies. It made it so much infinitely more difficult for Europeans. And then the AUKUS deal, which seemed to really push against a real understanding of what allies had done during the 4 years of the Trump administration, which is to carry Western values into the world as potentially a Democratic administration always intended to do. So really, ultimately, a mixed record, despite all the achievements on Ukraine and the achievements, clearly, I think one of the fundamental pieces now in maintaining a good and balanced relationship with the People's Republic of China, letting that not escalate, letting Chinese ambitions on Taiwan not escalate. I think those two pieces are clearly in the achievements column.
Cathryn, domestically, we know that Biden's approval ratings are very low. As a matter of fact, they're lower at this point than they were for Donald Trump 4 years ago. Where did Biden disappoint?
Well, I think a lot of people went to the polls in November solely based on their perceptions of the economy. And will have seen that even in this last moment, there's a legacy speech coming on domestic issues on Wednesday. The president is trying to score points with voters, alleviating student loan burden into the very last second. But those messages didn't seem to resonate sufficiently for the average American who was struggling with food prices, who was struggling with their own perceptions of inflation, and who, frankly, was unhappy with the way in which Democrats had not accepted the failures of the 2008-2009 financial crisis that had left so many American futures in ruins. But the other thing, Brent, is, of course, the narrative side on the MAGA Republican side had really and has really now won the day. The fact that over 60% of Republicans believed into Election Day this November that Joe Biden was an illegitimate president, that January 6th was a festival of love, and many people are hoping for 1,600 people behind bars who created violence in the heart of American democracy are justified to be released under a Trump administration, just highlights how much disaggregated narrative still exists in the United States of America. And so these perceptions mirror precisely what has shaped the entire political discussion over the last 4 years.
Political analyst Cathryn Clüver Ashbrook from the Bertelsmann Foundation here in Berlin. Cathryn, as always, good to see you. Good to get your analysis. Thank you.
Biden listed what he considered to be his achievements on the world stage, including standing up to China and rallying 50 nations to stand with Ukraine in its war against Russia. On Gaza, the president said the deal has the contours of his proposal he delivered last year. Here is some more of what he had to say.
On the war between Israel and Hamas, we're on the brink of a proposal that I laid out in detail months ago, finally coming to fruition. I have learned in many years of public service to never, 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 ever give up.
Let's go through that speech with DW's Benjamin Alvarez-Gruber, who joins me now from Washington, D.C. Ben, on the brink of a ceasefire, in Biden's words, but we've heard that before. Is anything different this time?
We've indeed heard that before, and that is leading many to also be rather skeptic with this news, what President Biden is saying. We have officials acknowledging the progress that both U.S. and Arab mediators have made overnight, brokering a ceasefire and the release of the hostages, but the deal has not been reached yet. An official speaking, of course, on condition of anonymity, said that all sides are closer than ever, but it could still fall apart. So if the sides are really aiming for a deal before the inauguration of President-elect Donald Trump on January 20th, they only have a couple of days left for that.
And do we know any more details about this agreement?
So what we know is that the talks are not happening only with the current administration, in this case President Biden's top Middle East advisor Brad McGurk, but also with the envoy of President-elect Trump, Steve Witkoff, who is also talking to the Emir of Qatar, who then is having meetings with with Hamas, the delegation of Hamas that is currently in Doha. So there is some hope for an agreement, but looking at it realistically, it's important to remember that the Biden administration, along with Egypt and Qatar, have spent more than a year trying to broker an agreement. So of course it remains to be seen if they succeed now with only a week left of the current administration.
Now, Biden also addressed some other important foreign policy issues. Ben, stay with us as we take a listen.
Compared to 4 years ago, America is stronger. Our alliances are stronger. Our adversaries and competitors are weaker. We have not gone to war to make these things happen. NATO is more capable than it's ever been. And many more of our allies are paying their fair share. Before I took office, 9 NATO allies were spending 2% of their GDP on defense. Now 23 are spending 2%.
So Biden there outlining his achievements, but is that the accepted position in the U.S.?
It depends on who you ask. So first, let's remember that this is the first of his farewell addresses. You could say is the outgoing president. He will also have another address from the Oval Office on Wednesday, but today the focus was on foreign policies. You could call it an attempt to try to sell the American public his foreign policy agenda and achievements. But if we look on Ukraine, if we look on NATO, President-elect Trump has repeatedly stressed that it was him and not Joe Biden that got member states to pay more. So we always have to be careful on what the achievements are presented during the speeches, if they happened during the 4 years or were actually said or laid out before, in this case, President Joe Biden took office. And one big topic that was mentioned rather briefly during this speech is the Israel-Hamas war. In front of the State Department, where he delivered the speech earlier today, we saw a group of protests of people also holding up a banner that was reading Biden's legacy is genocide, referring to Washington's support for Israel, and that there is no agreement yet to the end of the war in Gaza and to the release of the hostages, and that Washington did not enforce red lines with the Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu and continued providing weapons and diplomatic support, has been criticized by many, not only here in the US, for months. So there will also be a criticism that will remain if we look at the foreign policy legacy of outgoing President Joe Biden.
Definitely a time of much analysis as this transition goes through. DW's Benjamin Alvarez-Gruber reporting from Washington, D.C. Thank you for doing that for us.